Welcome, everyone. I'm Emily Ponchel, Public Programs Manager with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Mutinous Women, How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast. Meet the author Joan DeJean in conversation with Jack McCord. Before we get started, I want to say merci beaucoup to our neighbors at the Alliance Française of Chicago for co-sponsoring this program. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The Newberry reading rooms are open to visitors with no appointment necessary, Tuesday through Saturday, and our next exhibition, Surviving the Long Wars, Residues and Rebellions, opens on February 28th. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online classes, and virtual and in-person public programs like this one. Please also follow us on social media at Newberry Library. During the program, please enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and as time permits, our speakers will respond. Something special to note is that you can purchase your own copy of Mutinous Women signed by Joan DeJean online at bookshop.newberry.org, and this link will be posted in the chat. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Joan DeJean is trustee professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of 12 books on French history and material culture of the 17th and 18th centuries, including The Invention of Paris and The Essence of Style. Jack McCord served as executive director of the Alliance Française of Chicago for 16 years. His interests then, as now, include the history of the French presence in the New World. And now I will hand things over to Joan and Jack. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I want to thank, first of all, Jack for being here wherever here is in Zoom world. I also want to thank all those at the Newberry who helped us put this together. And I also want to thank the Newberry for their extraordinary generosity in making all of these documents, these maps, available online for public usage. I was able to use some in my book, Mutinous Women. It's a wonderful service to scholars. I finally want to apologize. You can hear my voice. I was very ill all last week, and I coughed most of my voice away. As of this morning, I have a supplemental pleasure. COVID rebound has given me a head cold, so my voice is not really good. Luckily, you'll be distracted by the beautiful maps from the Newberry collection. So forgive me. Okay, Jack.
Well, thank you, Joan. I just want to salute you like all inveterate artists. You go on with the show. So bravo for your fortitude. And it's been a pleasure working with you on this project. So this assiduously researched book with so much new information on a period of time that many of us don't know that much about or thought we knew. We obviously are aware of the French presence on the Gulf Coast, and particularly in and around New Orleans. While the traditional lore holds that the women sent to the Gulf Coast were bad women, undesirables expulsed from France, your book rejects that received history. Can you tell us more?
Okay, obviously the whole story is in the book, but I want to give just a quick introduction to the story here. 1718 to 1719 was the moment that determined these women's lives. The moment that determined the lives of a group of French women who have been enormously influential on this country in general, not just on the Gulf Coast. Everything about what happened was rooted in finance. And at that moment, the French economy was handed over to one man, an economic theorist, a Scottish economic theorist named John Law. John Law was allowed to do whatever he wanted, and in the space of 1 year, he put into place the first national bank. France had never had this, the first modern stock exchange, and he introduced paper money to Europe for the first time, all in 1 year. The value of all of this was based on one thing, a French colony, Louisiana. Law sold the idea to investors by saying that Louisiana was an El Dorado, sure to make them all rich, and they fell for it. In May 1719, a share of stock in his company sold for 500. In December 1719, that same share sold for over 10,000. And during that moment, the second half of 1719, John Law could do whatever he wanted. At one moment, he wanted women. For the new colony, he got them. Corrupt police officers arrested them en masse and arrested women specifically for deportation to Louisiana. In 1719, 225 female prisoners were sentenced to permanent exile and to deportation to Louisiana. Most of them were labeled prostitutes. What I try to show in my book is that they were instead victims of France's financial greed. 195 of them were taken in chains from Paris to French ports, and 135 of them were transported across the Atlantic in chains in the holds of 2 ships, a few of them in a first ship called the Two Brothers, and most of them in another ship called La Mutine, the Mutinous Woman, the title of my book.
It's just amazing. Can you give us an example of a story of perhaps one of these deported women?
Yeah, I'm going to choose one whose ties to the Newberry collection will become obvious tonight. Her name was Marie Bâhon, and she was orphaned very early, when she was 8, as a result of a period called the Great Winter. Huge climate change, and her whole family dies. Marie made her way to Paris, where she found work as a laundress. And maybe we could have the first slides here, please. In 1719, Marie was 16 years old, and she and a friend went one day to look at ribbons in a shop. The proprietor of the shop accused them of having stolen a ribbon and had them arrested. One of John Law's police officers made the arrest. This was June 1719, precisely the moment when the mass arrests of prostitutes to please John Law began. And this is her arrest. This is supposed to declare the reasons for her arrest. You notice her name is misspelled. It was Bâhon. She was illiterate. She couldn't verify. They just wrote down whatever. And these are her crimes. She frequented dubious characters, and she says that she is an orphan, as though she was an orphan, as though saying she was an orphan was a crime. There was no evidence of crime, no proof of guilt, and that was all there was. Because this wouldn't have stood up, the arresting officer then added, and I quote, he knew personally that she was a public prostitute, and that no evidence, no proof, the word of one police officer was enough to have her locked up. And months later, Marie Bâhon was deported to Louisiana on the Mutinous Woman. They forgot, by the way, to include her name on the list of women taken from Paris, so theoretically her deportation was illegal.
Since we're discussing the French colony of Louisiana, should we have an idea of what the French knew about it at the time?
Yeah, let's do this with maps. Everything's going to be maps tonight. If we can go to the second image, please. Okay, this is the kind of map that was available at the turn of the 18th century. The only kind of map. It's a very pretty, colorful map, but it's a fantasy. Do you want to talk about it a bit, Jack?
Well, I do, because it amuses me very much, having been to New Orleans a great deal, is that New Orleans is nowhere near where it is situated. In reality, if you look at the lower left-hand corner, there's a 1 between 2 ships, which is the mouth of the Mississippi, and New Orleans actually is up the river, and between number 3 and the Mississippi. Number 3 being Lake Pontchartrain, and of course there was no infrastructure, as is shown on this map either. There's no cathedral. There's no. In fact, I don't think anything had been built at this point in New Orleans, had it?
At that point, New Orleans did not exist, and they show a completely built-up city. It wasn't like this for another half century.
But they do show the natives, the very populous natives that they had documented for earlier.
Right.
Engaged in a variety of activities.
Right. And that, I think, is really interesting. So the only thing accurate shown the French prior to the moment of the women's deportation was a land heavily populated by Native Americans, of whom the French were terrified. There were all kinds of stories about this. And then maybe we can go to a better map, the next one.
Well, because the last one was perhaps the earliest documented example of false advertising.
There are many involving Louisiana, but it was one. And this is from the Newberry's collection as well. It's Nicolas de Fer from about 1718 to 20, so just the moment of deportation. The map, you'll notice, features above all the presence of Native Americans. You can't see this well here, that it's written all over the map. He notes an occasional French fort, but he illustrates the presence of indigenous peoples, the Missouris, the Illinois, the village of the Alabamans, the land of the Choctaws, whom he calls a populous nation.
How much territory was actually involved?
Maybe we can go. You can see how big it is here.
Huge,
and this
huge.
map, a modern, new one, shows. You can get an idea of the territory today, how many states of today's states are contain territory, part of that French colony of Louisiana. And it's the whole up and down the Mississippi, that vast trade route from Canada to the Gulf, virtually to the East Coast and the Carolinas, brushing up against Spanish Texas on the left. This was big, and a huge territory, virtually unsettled by Europeans at that moment when they arrived.
It's just amazing me you'd be able to superimpose this many states over that territory. It's just astounding how vast it is. So the women arrived on the Gulf Coast in chains, probably under very bad conditions. What time of year was it?
Okay, well, before we get to that, let's do this first. Because I can answer Jack's questions because of this book. This is the title page of a history, the first major history of French Louisiana, published in France in 1753. You're going to hear a lot about the man whose memoirs were the basis for it, Dumont. He's a huge figure in the Newberry's collection. Dumont, with history, is the only one to include the deported women. And thanks to Dumont, we know, first of all, that about 60 survived, and we know where their new lives began. We have the next one. So Jackson, they arrive in February.
February.
It's cold. And the first place they land is an island called Massacre Island. You can see here that it's, this is, by the way, a map by the author of the history, whose title page you just saw, a huge, one of the, in the Newberry's collection, a map of Massacre Island. You can see the island was populated, it had homes, it was built up, it had an infrastructure. The women were not allowed to stay there. By the way, can you imagine traveling across the Atlantic in chains and being dropped on an island called Massacre? That must have seemed like a pretty cruel twist of fate. But the women were not allowed to stay there. Instead, and we're going to go to the next slide. This is also by Dumont, but not in the Newberry's collection, in the collection in Paris. And you can see Massacre Island. They were taken 3 islands over to an island called Ship Island. And Ship Island was uninhabited, had no food supply, no storage places for food, no fresh water. They were left there in February with no protection from the elements, no shelter, no food.
Having survived such hardships, it seems amazing that they made it through their stay on Ship Island. But how did they do when they finally got to the mainland?
Okay. When they get to the mainland, they're incredible. They start spreading out all over. Some get to Arkansas. Today's Arkansas, obviously, the wildest country in the colony. Some made it up to Illinois, where they were among the people who planted the first wheat in Illinois. So some of these women were at the origin of the wheat fields of the Midwest. Some of them settled in Mobile, Alabama, the colony's original capital. Many settled in New Orleans, which by now was being built up. And Bâhon went all the way up to Natchez. Sorry. So that young woman who's arrested on trumped-up theft charges made it up to Natchez, where she married a farmer named Jean Roussin, a Frenchman. They farmed several acres and welcomed 2 sons. We know a great deal about their life in Natchez, once again, because of the historian Dumont.
It's amazing. Well, you know, I think for many of us, Natchez conjures up images of more of the 19th century, because that's when it became a great center of wealth. But why was it important at this early a date?
If John Law had had his way, Natchez would have been the center of wealth right away. Natchez was the linchpin of John Law's project for Louisiana. He claimed to his investors that tobacco would grow at Natchez, and the tobacco would be better than the tobacco on the east, in English colonies on the East Coast. And tobacco was the cash crop for the English in this country. Natchez was chosen as the principal site for the production of tobacco, even though tobacco had never been grown there before. But so when Marie Bâhon moved to Natchez in 1720, she moved to the place that was seen as the colony's great hope for financial success. And in Natchez, Marie Bâhon's life was thrown off course for a second time by the wild schemes of John Law.
What was her life in Natchez like?
Can we go to the next one, please? We know a lot about her life, once again, because of Dumont. Now, this is the map of Natchez in Dumont's printed book, which you just saw the title page. I had certain things highlighted The big building in the middle is the fort that protected the French settlement. Underneath it and slightly to the right is a very large home of the commander of the French garrison in Natchez. And to the right of that is a smaller home identified as the Maison du Sieur Roussin, the home of Roussin. In other words, Marie Bâhon's husband. No other private individuals are identified on this map, so that detail is significant. During Marie Bâhon's first years in Natchez, life was good. By 1724, Dumont says of the Marie Bâhon and her husband that they were prosperous inhabitants of Natchez. Not bad for a laundress deported from France 5 years earlier. And when they became prosperous, Marie and her husband were able to buy more land. And that's why you see the location here. Sorry.
Well, there's a story you'll tell later about the large home of the commandant, I think. But we'll tease that now, but not to go into the detail later. If tobacco was never grown successfully in Natchez, but the outpost did change the arc of French involvement in North America. And also, aside on that, I read a contemporary account of the smell of Louisiana tobacco was akin to something completely revolting. According to the contemporary account, unlike that of Virginia tobacco, which of course they were trying to emulate that prosperity in the English colonies. Right. But can you talk to us about Natchez, the history of that and what happened?
And here's another, this is the map of Natchez by Dumont in the Newberry collection, and it's the model for the map that's used in his printed work. And you can see once again the fort in the middle, the commander's house just below, and this time to the right, the house is identified as private homes of inhabitants. He doesn't give the name of Marie Bâhon, her husband. He does name, however, the commander. De Chapelle was his name, and there was a good reason why he named the commander. Dumont was laying blame. Dumont was an army officer. He knew Natchez, he knew the land, he knew the inhabitants. He'd been posted there for years. This was well familiar territory to him. The French outposts had taken its name from the Natchez nation. One of those nations, Defer characterized on his map as populous. The Natchez vastly outnumbered the French, whose garrison consisted at its high point of 80 soldiers. And because of that imbalance, French commanders always understood you maintain good relations with the Natchez. And they, for example, when they acquired land, the fort, for the home, etc., it was done on terms acceptable to all sides. So there were problems, of course, but nothing like what followed. When de Chapelle became commander of Natchez, and that's when the problems began. From here on, I'll follow the history as it's recounted by Dumont in his history of Natchez. Commander Chapelle knew about the dream of tobacco and how it would make everyone rich. And with that in mind, he decided that he wanted private land on which he could grow tobacco and become rich. So he decided he would take not just any land, but the land, you can see the very middle upper part of the map. That's the village of the Natchez, and just to the right below it, their great temple. That's the land he wanted. The Natchez explained to him that this was sacred ground for them. And he said no, he still wanted it. They pretended to agree to his terms and they left. But at 9 a.m., on Monday, November 28th, 1730, the Natchez returned and they proceeded to wipe out the entire garrison, killing some 229 French men, women, and children, 1/10 of the entire population, European population of Louisiana. Among those killed were Marie Bâhon's husband and her elder son. Marie herself was taken captive and held hostage for about 3 months, first by the Natchez and then by their allies, the Choctaw. The first French account sent back to France laid the blame on the Natchez. Dumont, however, repeatedly asserted that only one man and one man alone was to blame, Commander Chepin. Dumont freely admitted that he was not in Natchez that fatal day, and for his account, he explained, he had relied on eyewitness testimony, that of a woman who survived and was taken hostage. By now you've guessed her identity, Marie Bâhon. After her captivity, Marie Bâhon remarried, and her new husband was Dumont, the future historian, the man who made these maps and wrote the history. And that's why the deported women's story is written into Dumont's history.
Just amazing. What happened to them after their marriage?
At first, they tried farming again. They moved downriver on the Mississippi, just above New Orleans, in an area known then as now as the German coast. And once again, in Newberry's collection is this image of their farm on the German coast.
Well, and that's also known as, I think today, is that the Des Allemands Parish as well?
Sure.
Yeah,
The name hasn't changed. You'll note he was always careful to note the names. That the Mississippi was for decades known to the French. Could we go back just 1 second? Sorry. Not as the Mississippi, but as the St. Louis River. And Dumont always notes things like that. Okay, now we can go on. Sorry. And this is a sort of strange map. The next place where they lived, it's New Orleans, but I don't know how to describe it. New Orleans in a big context, because New Orleans is in fact that rather small rectangle in the middle of the bottom, and the rest is the bayous, the wilderness all around the city. That last little illustration to the right is a rendering of a home in New Orleans. And the Newberry also has this next image, which is the next one. Yeah, great. Which is that in detail, Dumont's drawing of what a private home in New Orleans looked like, what his home in New Orleans looked like. So this is the home where he and Marie Bâhon lived in the early 1730s, and which they shared with their son and their daughter.
One of the things I love about this illustration is the ladder near the house that leads where the poultry can take to roost in the trees,
right,
to sleep. I love that. Can we know where they actually lived in New Orleans? Besides, to go into more detail?
Yeah. So this is not by Dumont. We had to break pattern once. This is a 1731 map of the city, and it has a key. So it marks lots in the city, and the key allows you to determine who lives where. I use dots to indicate the presence of deported women. By 1730, the deported women had become a huge presence in New Orleans. Between 8 and 10% of the homes in private hands in New Orleans were in the hands of women who had been deported from France barely a decade before. You can see that they live all over what we call the French Quarter today. Dumont and Marie Bâhon are one of the circles at the top. They lived in the center of the city, the dead center of the city, the northern edge, at the corner of Orleans Street and Dauphine Street. Dauphine Street wasn't named yet, but the city, officially, but the citizens already knew what to call it. So you can see that they were a huge presence, and they lived there in the city with all kinds of women she would have known from her past, from the deportation.
I just think it's astounding you were able to actually locate where they lived, given this many years. It's just unbelievable.
Well,
so how long were they? How long were they in New Orleans?
They were there until 1737. So that's a good number of years. And in 1737, they returned to France with their children. In the years immediately following their return to France, Dumont wrote the memoirs, which there's a manuscript of them in the Newberry collection, and you've seen the title page of the printed version. He also drew the maps now in the Newberry collection. So he was drawing up their heritage, their story in a way. In 1754, Marie Bâhon and Dumont went to sea again. First, they went to the Île Bourbon, today's Mauritius, and later they went to India, where they lived in Pondichéry, which was the principal French outpost in India.
Amazing. And still, by the way, was in French hands up until 1954.
Yeah.
So what was Pondicherry like for them? What were their lives like?
The years they were in Pondichéry were not Pondichéry's best years for the French. We think of the 7 Years' War and the losses of French territory as primarily losses of territory on the North American continent. However, they lost ground in India as well, and they lost the fort at Pondichéry. Battles were going on the entire time that Bâhon and Dumont were living there. They were fighting for this. Everyone agrees that Pondichéry was lost because of the incompetence of the French general leading the battles. Dumont was probably killed, died in 1760, probably in the struggle for control of Pondichéry. So in other words, a second incompetent French general determined his life in Pondichéry. And by the way, one last detail about this. When they were in India, the French Indies Company was represented by Jean Law. He was the nephew of John Law, born in Paris in November 1719, so the month before the women were deported. He was born when his uncle was all powerful, and he had this career with the Indies Company. Can you imagine for Marie Bâhon? She must have felt that the specter of John Law was with her till the end. We don't know when Marie Bâhon died. Once Dumont was dead, no one recorded her death.
Are there any other deported women that had a life like hers? It just seems extraordinary given where she came from.
I think it is an extraordinary life. No one, no one liked Marie Bâhon, first of all, because she was the only person to return to France. She was the only deported woman to get out of Louisiana. However, many of them had lives extraordinary in other ways. In conclusion, I'd like to stress one way. These women, so many of these women founded remarkable dynasties that have continued over time, and they have so many descendants today. In recent months, I've been hearing from descendants of deported women. They live all over this country. California, New York, Texas, New Jersey, everywhere. I have not heard from anyone in Illinois yet, but I have hope still that someone will turn up, and I can virtually guarantee that someone in the audience tonight is a descendant from a deported woman and just doesn't know it yet.
I love it. This is a fantastic story, Joan. Bravissimo. Wonderful. And I think it's now time for questions. Emily, can you help us with that?
Absolutely. We have so many questions rolling in. I just checked my 23andMe and I didn't see any connection with any of these women, sadly. But the question that I want to lead off with, which I was thinking while I was listening to this remarkable story, it comes from Love's Dogs. It says, wow, I never knew about this. I never knew about this either. When did you first discover this, or how did you discover this story?
One day I was in the archives in Paris. I was looking at 1719. I was trying to find someone whose name began in F. And I saw this folder, and it gave a name that wasn't the person I was looking for. Normally, I would have just turned it over and continued. But someone had added, and other female prisoners destined for Louisiana. And that was strange, first of all, but also I grew up in Louisiana, and the idea of female prisoners destined for Louisiana piqued my curiosity. And when I opened it, it wasn't just a straight prison file. They had dumped all kinds of documents into it. So I got a whole preview of the lists of women being drawn up for deportation, etc. So after that, I was hooked.
I mean, what a moment of serendipity, Joan.
It's exactly. Like yeah. If I hadn't been, I don't know who the person was or why I was interested in them. But if that hadn't happened that day, and if someone hadn't written that on the cover, never would have looked.
And so you find these papers and you come across it and you've painted this beautiful story of these women, but some of our viewers, they want to know a few more specifics. We have a great question from Paula. Paula wants to know, what were the ethnicities and religions of the enslaved women?
The enslaved women, the deported women.
The deported women.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All among those who were deported, only 2 were not French. They were Irish. A group of Irish women were arrested one day randomly in a garden. They claimed they were all public prostitutes. The youngest one, who was deported and who survived, was 5 at the time of her arrest. Public prostitute at age 5. She survived, married a husband. Her husband was killed at Natchez, was a soldier. And she lived in New Orleans. Her home is indicated on that map. Otherwise, they were French, but from all over. a good many Parisians, but many from all kinds of Bâhons from a tiny village near Chartres. They were from Orleans, France, cities in eastern France, cities in northern France. It was covered all the country. Officially, all these women were Catholic. In France, to be anything else is illegal. You can't be. So I'll never know. I would suspect that there were probably, excuse me, a couple of Protestants mixed in, but that just doesn't occur. You can't learn that.
And we have a question from Jeffrey, and Jeffrey's kind of wanting clarification on really the purpose behind the government, because you referenced this is a financial situation that's going on. So Jeffrey asks, what was the point of abducting women and dropping them on an empty island? Were they thinking they were going to get labor out of them?
I wish I knew, Jeffrey. They got the scheme going, and it's the head of the warden of the women's prison where they were incarcerated was all for it. She kept saying, it will free my prison up. It will clear my prison up. We're overcrowded. Nobody thought they weren't sending. They wondered at first. They thought they might lock them all up in a prison in Louisiana. Someone suggested a prison colony, moving them far to the north to isolate them. By the time they got across the ocean and were on Massacre Island, John Law's scheme was crashing. So it all fell apart. People were worried about bankruptcy, and nobody cared about them. So they just went. But nobody ever laid plans for them.
And so they got to the island, and we have a question from just a Zoom user.
Sure.
So once they got to the mainland, how did they actually travel through the countryside? Did they travel on foot? How did they get the money to navigate through this area?
Often, many of them married on the Gulf Coast and traveled with their husbands. Many of the husbands were landowners or being sent to work on land grants, concessions, and they had transportation. People traveled as they could on horseback, on navigating the Mississippi and other bayous in small boats, pirogues.
And we have a few people asking kind of a similarly related question, so I'll read both of them. We have a question from Linus Lee, and Linus says, does this story of these women, the families, cross over with the story of those transported from Canada to Louisiana later in the century? And then we have another question. It says, would there be any connection to the Quebecois diaspora to New England? I'm curious if there's any connection. So they're kind of thinking about this Canadian back.
Right. I know nothing about such connections. There were undoubtedly ties forged at various points among people from these various French populations, but this was a separate earlier deportation to Louisiana.
And we have a question from one of our neighbors at the Alliance Française, Aimée Leverge. She wants to know, Joan, how important is your research in archives and writing your books, including Mutinous Women? And is research the most time-consuming part of your writing practice? And finally, is it the most enjoyable?
Tough. Definitely the most time-consuming. I can spend a week on something that eventually is a half sentence in a book. To try to track someone down may take forever, and it may not work. I love it, so I have no regrets about that. And it is, though, I think for me, the core of everything. If I were not doing research in archives, I would never have written.
And how long did it take you to complete the book, Joan, if you don't mind
I
me
don't
asking?
know. I don't know because there were detours here and
Mhm.
there. There was also a big one later, and a big change in things. We know it as the lockdown of March 2020. I was
Mhm.
heading to France for a last big research push when I learned that that wouldn't be a good idea. So I had to think about what I had and reconfigure and write based on what I had.
And we have a question from Christine Maynard. She goes, I'm fascinated to know how you located this information in France. I'm a double major in French and history and would love to know more about how you fell into this. Do you speak French? And then another kind of, I'll group these questions together. Ginny Lee says, did you find this information at the BNF in Paris or another archive? So these
No,
are just.
not at all. The main source for me was the police, well known as the police archive in the Bastille archives. They're the archives of all Parisian prisons. They're in the Arsenal Library. That's why I found that dossier originally. That's a huge source. There's also a police archive outside of Paris where you have things like lockup books. So you can see the arrests on any given day in these years, who was arrested, who the arresting officer was, etc. And then at the National Archives, there is a huge source, once again, the Parliament's archives. That's all the trial proceedings. So in many cases, I was lucky enough to find things. There are also all kinds of strange archives there. You can't tell what you're going to find there. It involves digging, just digging. And you do have to know how to read 18th century French hands.
I know just looking at that one image, just being able to decipher the letters is a challenge in itself.
And that's a piece of cake. When people transcribe trial proceedings, they just scrawl. Also,
Yeah.
police officers often have pretty bad handwriting.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So in all this digging, Joan, we have a question. It says, do you happen to know the owner and captain of the ship, so La Mutine? This Deborah says two brothers, I believe.
It was an Indies company ship. The captain was a man named de Masson, one man. Oh, the two brothers is another ship.
Oh, okay.
That was Captain Ferret.
Oh, there's someone in the audience, J. Paul Hawthorne. He says, "I see my ancestor in your book." So there are ancestors. Her
Can you see?
name.
Would he be willing to tell us her name?
He says her name is Marie Anne Forchet. No,
Oh,
venture to guess.
sure.
And I am descended from her second husband, Pierre Laurentini.
Laurentini. One of the big dynasties, Laurentini. This is Mobile, Alabama. People can have no idea how much land around Mobile was in the hands of this family. I hope he's seen my book, so he will know. But the rest of you should read, see these deported women they're sitting on vast tracts of land in no time at all.
And about the women and their legacy and their descendants. But we have a question from Barbara. Sorry, Barbara, if I say your last name wrong. Kammerer. She says, did any of the women leave like their own written account of their lives after they arrived in Louisiana? Is there any record of that?
No, sadly. Many of them were illiterate. I mean, there's a huge percentage of illiteracy. One of them, Jean Mahou, who may have the largest number of descendants of any deported woman, Jean Maheu was highly literate, and she inventoried all her possessions, kept records of her births of her children, so you get a sense of personality in those documents.
And that kind of loops into another question. It's just from Zoom user. It says, were any of the women and girls educated literate? So
Yes,
there,
Jean was. She was maybe the most literate, but numbers of them were.
and of any of these women, we have a question. It just gives the zip code 60676. It says, do you know if any of these women became slave owners?
Yes. Slavery, I'm going to touch briefly on a huge and hugely important topic. Excuse me. There were no enslaved Africans, excuse me, or virtually none in the whole lower Mississippi Valley when John Law took over. John Law also introduced slavery. Tobacco needed workers. He felt tobacco required enslaved Africans. So the first slave ship for the Gulf Coast arrived just before the women. So they arrived with slavery into this colony. Some of them did become very quick. Those who made the financially most advantageous marriages because it became slave owners. The Indies Company tried to force everyone to buy slaves from the Indies Company because they made a profit. They were pushing slavery as an institution. So it's a very complicated story.
Kind of along the same lines, we have an anonymous attendee who asks, says, would the speaker be more specific about how exactly John Law's scheme worked? Was Mr. Law paying off the police officers? Was he then advertising that there were women in Louisiana to attract men moving there?
No, the police officers, I can't tell how it would have worked. I know about the corruption from a very good source. In the National Archives, there are 5 huge, when I say huge boxes, I can't do the full measure. They're so heavy, no one could lift them. They would roll them to me on a cart of testimony about corruption in the police force in Paris in these years. And the most of the officers who were arresting these women were denounced in these in this testimony. Hundreds and hundreds of ordinary Parisians came forward to describe. For example, if they decided they wanted money from someone, they would say, you have to give us a kickback. If you said, I'm too poor, I can't afford that, then they would arrest you. And then they would tell your family, if you want them released, you have to pay money. So it was a world of police corruption. I think the financial greed of John Law corrupted so much of French society at that moment.
And some of the questions are kind of bouncing around, but I want to try to get to as many as I can with the 6 minutes that we have left. Another interesting question that came across, because you talked about these confrontations that happened with the Natchez. So Robin Simon asks, how did the French communicate with the Natchez? Which group learned the other's language?
Probably both ways, I bet, but the French always had interpreters. It is generally accepted, for example, in addition, someone like Marie Bâhon, who lived there, knew Mobilian. That was a sort of lingua franca of communication in the lower Mississippi Valley. So she clearly, during her captivity, was able to speak with the Natchez. So there were various forms of communication.
And another question coming in from Melissa Denfriend. Melissa asks, are there any homes or businesses in New Orleans that are still owned by descendants of these ladies?
Now that's interesting. That's a question I've never asked. I know that there is land there. Maybe we could show that extra image now, if that's okay. Is that okay to do that?
Sure.
Okay, Jack, tell people what this is.
Well, I think this is Lafitte's blacksmith shop
Yeah.
in the French Quarter. It's actually a reconstruction of what it's still very old, but it's what would have been built very, very close to the design of what would have been built in the French Quarter at this time. So those of us who are familiar with New Orleans, for instance, you see here on the right, a snippet of a 19th century structure. And most of what we think of as the architecture of the French Quarter is actually Spanish and not French. But this is what it would have looked like at the time, or something very similar. That sort of extended eave. And if anyone's familiar with St. Genevieve, Missouri, south of St. Louis, which has very, very old structures, original French structures, they resemble this as well.
And this, by the way, was property owned by the daughter of a deported woman in the 1750s. So that's why I thought of it in that context. The first homes in New Orleans were very simple. By the way, land ownership was quite primitive. If you were among the first people in New Orleans, they desperately needed labor. If you cleared land and built on it, it was yours. That's how these women became property owners. And the first houses we know, because Dumont tells us, they had to fell cypress trees all over that site. And cypress is great wood. They cut it up so the first homes were built of cypress from the trees they had felled to clear the land for their lot. So this would have been the second generation, pretty fancy for early.
Well, I think a good note to leave us on, we have a lovely comment from Paula. Paula says, please thank her, so please thank Joan, and her kindness and generosity of agreeing to do this talk with the case of rebound COVID. So I want to express my personal gratitude to you, Joan, and to you, Jack, for putting together such a lovely conversation and sharing with us this remarkable story of these women. So thank you so much, Joan and Jack.
Thank you, guys. It was lovely to do this.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And again, our special thanks to the Alliance Française of Chicago for co-sponsoring this program. Coming up this month, they have a variety of fantastic events which celebrate the art, history, and culture of France. You can learn more and register to attend by heading over to the Alliance website. It's www.af-chicago.org, and this link will also be posted in the chat. And don't forget to purchase your signed copy of Mutinous Women, How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast at bookshop.newberry.org. And don't log off yet. Don't go anywhere. This is the most important part. This wonderful conversation was brought to you free thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. Join this amazing group. Support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And please join us for our next program on the life and times of Sultan Suleiman, a Meet the Author event with Kaya Sahin in conversation with Elizabeth Brodini on Thursday, February 23rd at 6 p.m. at the Newberry, and we will also live stream this event on Zoom. You can register for this program and sign up for our mailing list at newberry.org. Good night.